It must be dreadful for them. I can't imagine what it must be like, and particularly after all these years.
Can you remember this area being searched at the time, 7 years ago?
No. Don't think it was even entered into it. I don't think it's ever been mentioned until very recently.
What was the exact moment, let me ask you, Kate, when you realised Madeleine had gone?
Well, I went back to do a check at 10 o'clock and I went through the patio doors at the back and I listened for a minute in the living room and it was all quiet, and I just noticed that the door to the children's bedroom was quite far open, and we always leave it just so it's slightly ajar just to let a little bit of light in. And I thought to myself,
When investigators revisit the long and painful story of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, a single figure repeatedly emerges in the shadows. He is not a stranger passing through Praia da Luz, not a convicted predator later tied to the case, but a man inside the circle itself, Dr. David Payne, one of the Tapas 7, a close friend of the McCanns, and a companion on that fateful holiday. The hypothesis that David Payne was directly involved in Madeleine's disappearance is uncomfortable, but it is built on a series of anomalies, contradictions, and silences that demand closer scrutiny. On the afternoon of May 3, 2007, the very day Madeleine vanished, Payne stands out for one critical reason. He was the only person outside of her parents who entered apartment 5A. This visit occurred at approximately 6:30 p.m. when, according to Payne's own testimony, he stopped by briefly to see if Kate McCann needed anything. Payne later stated that he saw Madeleine dressed in her pajamas, calm and relaxed, a vision he described with surprising vividness. He remembered not just her appearance but the impression she left, comparing her to a doll, emphasizing her striking look. It was, on the surface, a benign encounter, a friend checking on another friend. Yet the details of this visit would soon become one of the most contentious and puzzling elements of the case. The problem begins with the contradictions. Jerry McCann, returning from a tennis game around that same time, reported that when he walked into the apartment, he found Kate and the children inside, but no David Payne. Kate herself initially gave an account in which she mentioned nothing about Payne's visit. Only later did her story shift, acknowledging that Payne had stopped by. In a case where every minute was dissected and where discrepancies were seized upon by police and media alike, this contradiction between Payne's testimony and the McCanns' versions should have triggered intense follow-up. Yet it did not. Instead, Payne's explanation remained largely unchallenged. This gap created a lingering question. Was Payne truly in the apartment when he claimed, and if so, why was his presence omitted or forgotten by Madeleine's own parents? The uncertainties of that early evening pale, however, compared with the void later that night. Between 9:05 p.m. and 10 p.m. lies the so-called deadly gap. The 55 minutes when Madeleine was last seen alive by her father and when Kate discovered her missing. Jerry conducted his check around 9:05, reporting that all was well. Kate raised the alarm just before 10, discovering the bed empty and the shutter open. During that crucial window, no one could verify David Payne's whereabouts. Unlike other members of the Tapas group, who were observed moving between the restaurant and their apartments, or were accounted for by one another, Payne seemed to vanish into the fabric of the evening. When later questioned, he offered a highly polished account of the night, one so detailed it struck some observers as rehearsed, almost like a script learned by heart. The very precision of his answers down to exact times and descriptions raised the suspicion that this was not the spontaneous memory of a man recalling a traumatic evening, but a constructed narrative designed to withstand interrogation. Further weight was added by an outside observation. A witness, known as Mrs. C, recalled seeing a man acting nervously near the McCanns' apartment at around the same time frame, between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Her description was not definitive, but the coincidence of location and timing was difficult to ignore. If Payne was indeed unaccounted for during that period, and if a nervous man was seen near the very apartment where Madeleine was about to be discovered missing, the implication is troubling. Physical evidence, though never conclusive, also circles back to Payne. Specialist cadaver and blood dogs, deployed in apartment 5A, alerted to the scent of blood and human decomposition around the sofa. Forensic analysis later noted fibers found in the apartment that did not match the furnishings. Critics have suggested these fibers resembled material associated with clothing worn by Payne. Though no DNA match or conclusive laboratory result ever tied him directly, the possibility that trace evidence near the very spot where dogs signaled could be linked to him remains an unsettling thread. Payne denied any connection, but investigators noted that he appeared uncomfortable and evasive when these questions were raised. Even outside of the physical apartment, Payne's trail grew colder where it should have grown warmer. Telephone records revealed that his mobile device fell silent for more than 24 hours surrounding the disappearance. In the modern world, particularly on a group holiday, such a stretch without calls or messages is unusual. Only one record stood out: a 3-minute call made on the afternoon of May 3 from near the Ocean Club. When asked about it, Payne said he could not remember whom he had called or why. This absence of explanation, coupled with the otherwise inexplicable silence of his phone, suggested either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate concealment. Taken together, these fragments an uncorroborated visit to the apartment at 6:30 p.m., a missing hour in the critical window between 9 and 10 p.m., an oddly rehearsed testimony, a nervous man sighted nearby, suspicious forensic indications on the sofa, unexplained fabric fibers, and a silent phone punctuated by a mysterious call begin to form a mosaic. It is not a mosaic of certainty. No court has ever charged David Payne, and official investigations have treated him only as a witness. Yet it is a mosaic of probability, one that points back again and again to his potential involvement. The hypothesis, then, is stark: David Payne was not simply a bystander, not merely a friend swept into tragedy by misfortune. Instead, between 6:30 p.m. and 10 p.m. on May 3, 2007, he may have played an active role in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. This hypothesis does not rest on a single piece of definitive proof. There has never been one, but on the accumulation of anomalies, each of which alone might be explained, but together strain the limits of coincidence. The contradictions in testimony, the silent gaps in time, the unexplained fibers, the muted phone, the over-prepared answers all suggest that Payne knew more than he admitted, and perhaps acted in ways he never confessed. The failure to pursue this line of inquiry with vigor remains one of the enduring criticisms of the investigation. By focusing on external suspects, on abduction theories, or on alternative explanations, authorities may have overlooked the individual standing within arm's reach of the McCanns themselves. If Payne was involved, the truth of what occurred that night has been buried under layers of silence his own, the group's collective silence, and the institutional reluctance to pull on threads that might unravel a larger fabric. In conclusion, the hypothesis that David Payne was directly involved in Madeleine's disappearance forces us to confront the most disquieting possibility: that the danger was not outside the apartment but inside, among trusted friends. Between the innocuous-sounding visit at 6:30 p.m. and the frantic discovery at 10 p.m. lies a chasm filled with contradictions, unexplained behaviors, and unanswered questions. Until those questions are addressed, until Payne's role is fully examined, the case of Madeleine McCann will remain not only a story of a missing child, but of a missing truth. When investigators and journalists revisit the Madeleine McCann case, they often focus on David Payne, the friend of the McCanns whose presence in Praia da Luz has drawn so many questions. Yet beside him throughout that holiday was his wife, Dr. Fiona Payne. While David has faced whispers and speculation about his actions, Fiona has largely escaped public scrutiny. She has rarely spoken to the press, seldom issued statements, and in comparison to Kate and Jerry McCann, who have lived in the spotlight for nearly 2 decades, Fiona has remained a figure of silence. And in that silence lies another disturbing hypothesis: that Fiona Payne knew what happened to Madeleine and chose to protect her husband, either as a silent witness or as an active accomplice in a cover-up. Unlike the McCanns, who gave interviews, organized campaigns, and became familiar faces to millions across the globe, the Paynes retreated from public view. Their restraint was striking. Both were doctors, both well-educated professionals accustomed to communication. Yet in the aftermath of the disappearance they spoke little. Kate and Jerry, for all the criticism they endured, faced cameras, police interrogations, and constant questioning. The Paynes did not. To some observers, this difference was simply a reflection of roles. The McCanns were the parents, the central victims, while the Paynes were only friends. To others, however, the contrast suggested strategy. Remaining quiet can be an act of self-preservation, a way to avoid entanglement in details that might later conflict. It can also be a way of keeping secrets. Within the so-called Tapas 7, the group of friends who dined together at the Ocean Club, that evening there was always an assumption of unity. Each member gave statements to the police, each tried to reconstruct the night's events, and each was questioned about their movements. Over time, critics began to describe the Tapas group as bound by a pact of silence. This phrase was not meant literally, but it captured a sense that their testimonies had been carefully aligned. None of them directly contradicted one another in ways that would unravel the group's credibility. Discrepancies existed, yes, but they were smoothed over, minimized, or explained away as the fog of memory. The impression was that no one within the Tapas circle was willing to break ranks and point fingers. If David Payne had acted improperly, or if suspicions existed within the group, the public never heard them. The circle remained closed. It is in this context that Fiona Payne's role must be examined. Unlike her husband, she was never accused of inappropriate gestures or of telling suspiciously detailed stories. She was, however, present on the holiday, aware of the group's schedule, and familiar with the shifting accounts of who was where at what time. She would have known whether her husband truly went into apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m. She would have known whether his absence during the 9:05 to 10 p.m. window was natural or suspicious. She would have been privy to the whispered conversations among the Tapas friends in the immediate aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance. As a mother herself, traveling with her own children, she would have noticed if David's behavior raised alarm. Yet through all of this, Fiona never broke her silence. She never suggested that her husband's story was wrong, never admitted uncertainty, never contradicted the collective narrative. One hypothesis is that Fiona was simply a loyal wife, choosing not to doubt David or to expose him to further speculation. In this reading, her silence was protective, born of loyalty rather than complicity. But another hypothesis is more troubling, that Fiona not only knew what David had done, but actively participated in concealing it. This theory rests on the way the Tapas group presented itself to police. Their statements overlapped, sometimes to the point of appearing rehearsed. Their timelines contained gaps, particularly in the crucial hour before Kate's discovery. When pressed, they supported one another. The absence of any serious internal contradiction could be explained by chance, or it could be the result of deliberate coordination. If deliberate, Fiona's presence as David's wife would have been critical. She could affirm his whereabouts, vouch for him if needed, or remain vague in ways that shielded him. The possibility that Fiona was an accomplice in silence raises uncomfortable questions. If she truly knew that David was directly involved in Madeleine's disappearance, why did she not speak out? Was it fear of losing her family, her professional standing, her marriage? Or was it a calculation that aligning herself with the group and its unified testimony was safer than telling the truth? In cases of collective secrecy, psychology shows that silence can be contagious. Once a group commits to a version of events, each member has an incentive to maintain it, lest their own credibility be destroyed. Fiona may have rationalized her silence as self-protection, or even as an act of loyalty to friends who were already under siege by the press. Consider also the gender dynamics within the group. Kate McCann bore the brunt of public suspicion, scrutinized for her demeanor, criticized for perceived coldness, and interrogated as a potential suspect herself. Fiona, by contrast, drew little notice. This invisibility may have worked to her advantage. While the spotlight burned elsewhere, she was able to maintain her distance, never volunteering contradictions that might harm David. Silence, in her case, was not only safer but easier to sustain. The public did not expect her to speak, and so she did not. The hypothesis that Fiona Payne was a knowing accomplice also explains certain enduring mysteries. Why did the Tapas group never fracture under the pressure of interrogation and media attention? Why did no one, in nearly 2 decades, step forward with a different story? Why did obvious inconsistencies such as the clash between David's and Jerry's accounts at 6:30 never lead to open conflict within the group? One answer is that loyalty ran deep. Another is that Fiona and others had too much to lose. If she admitted that David's story was false, she would implicate not only her husband but herself for having concealed it. There is also the question of the pact of silence. This phrase, though never officially confirmed, became symbolic of the case. To maintain such a pact requires more than passive agreement. It requires active reinforcement. Every member of the Tapas 7 had to play their part. Fiona's role may have been precisely that, to reinforce the silence, to ensure that no cracks appeared in the story. As David's wife, her loyalty would have been assumed. But as a mother, her silence carried even greater weight. If she, another parent, expressed no suspicion of David, why should outsiders? Her silence effectively shielded him, making it harder for investigators to isolate him as a suspect. Of course, there is no conclusive evidence that Fiona Payne participated in a cover-up. Like her husband, she has never been charged with any crime related to the case. She remains, officially, a witness. But the hypothesis persists because her silence is too perfect, too consistent, and too convenient. When silence itself becomes the loudest signal, it demands interpretation. And the interpretation that fits the anomalies is that Fiona knew far more than she admitted. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann is compounded by these layers of secrecy. If Fiona Payne indeed knew what happened, she holds a key that could unlock the mystery. Yet that key has never been used. Instead, the story remains sealed behind the walls of a group determined to protect itself. For investigators, this represents one of the most frustrating elements of the case. They can examine forensic evidence, reconstruct timelines, and interrogate witnesses. But without a break in the wall of silence, the truth remains elusive. In conclusion, the hypothesis that Fiona Payne knew the truth and chose to cover for her husband is not a fringe idea, but a logical extension of the evidence or the lack of it. Her presence on the holiday, her silence in the aftermath, her alignment with the group's collective testimony, and her failure to contradict David all point to complicity, whether passive or active. Fiona Payne may not have caused Madeleine's disappearance herself, but by shielding her husband and helping maintain the pact of silence, she may have ensured that the world would never know what truly happened that night. In this sense, she is not just a background figure, but a central link in the chain of secrecy, a link without which the silence might have broken long ago. Until that silence is pierced, Fiona remains one of the most important and most overlooked figures in the Madeleine McCann case. 2 years before Madeleine McCann vanished in Praia da Luz, an unsettling episode unfolded during another holiday, this time in Majorca in 2005. At the center of that story were the same familiar names: David Payne, Jerry McCann, and their close circle of friends. What occurred there was not a disappearance, nor a crime scene, but a conversation that left witnesses deeply unsettled. The testimonies that emerged later from this trip have haunted the investigation ever since, casting a shadow over David Payne's character and raising difficult questions about how much was known and how much was ignored. The key witnesses were Dr. Caterina Gaspar and her husband, Dr. Arul Savio Gaspar. Both were medical professionals, trusted colleagues, and friends within the same social orbit as the McCanns and the Paynes. On that holiday in Majorca, the Gaspars joined the group for dinners and casual gatherings. According to Caterina's later testimony, it was during one of these evenings that she observed a conversation between David Payne and Jerry McCann that struck her as profoundly inappropriate. In her statement to police, Caterina described sitting between the two men at dinner. She remembered Payne making a comment that, in her interpretation, referred to Madeleine or to young children in general. As he spoke, he gestured with his hands in a way that she perceived as suggestive, mimicking behavior that caused her immediate alarm. The combination of words and gestures, she said, carried an explicit insinuation. For her, It was not a joke to be brushed aside or misunderstood. It was something disturbing enough to remain fixed in her memory years later. Aurel Gaspar supported his wife's account. In his own testimony, he recalled the discomfort he felt as Payne made remarks of a similar nature. Although he admitted that he did not confront Payne directly, at the time perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of not wanting to disrupt the atmosphere, he confirmed that the exchange left him uneasy. Both husband and wife agreed that the incident had been inappropriate, unsettling, and memorable for all the wrong reasons. For Katerina, the effect was immediate and lasting. She later told police, "From that moment, I never again allowed my daughter to be alone in Payne's presence." That statement alone speaks volumes. It reflects the instinctive protective reaction of a mother who, having witnessed behavior she considered alarming, made the decision to create distance between her child and the man responsible. She did not laugh it off or dismiss it as poor humor. Instead, she treated it as a red flag, an indication that Payne could not be trusted around children. This is what makes the Gaspar's testimonies so powerful. They were not strangers looking for attention or outsiders eager to insert themselves into a famous case. They were friends, doctors, respected members of the community, people whose credibility was difficult to dismiss. They came forward not at the height of media frenzy, but as part of their moral responsibility once Madeleine disappeared. Their words carried weight precisely because they had known Payne and Jerry personally, and because their professional training made them cautious, rational observers. Yet the troubling element of this story is not only the content of the Gaspar statements, but also the timing of their arrival into the investigation. Madeleine disappeared on May 3, 2007. The Gaspars provided their statements to Leicestershire Police in the United Kingdom on May 16, just 2 weeks after the disappearance. But those statements did not reach Portuguese investigators until October of the same year, 5 months later. By then, Gonçalo Amaral, the original Portuguese lead investigator, had been removed from the case. The delay meant that one of the most alarming testimonies was withheld during the most crucial stage of the investigation, when leads were fresh, interviews were ongoing, and suspects were still being evaluated. This 5-month gap is not a minor administrative hiccup. In an investigation where every day mattered, where borders could have been monitored more aggressively and suspects interrogated more thoroughly, half a year represented a lost opportunity. Why, then, were these statements delayed? Why were they not passed on to the Portuguese police immediately, as would have been expected in a case of such magnitude? The answer has never been fully explained. Critics argue that the delay was deliberate, a conscious act to protect David Payne from scrutiny. The logic behind this claim is straightforward. Had Amaral's team received the Gaspar statements in May, Payne might have been interrogated more aggressively, perhaps even treated as a suspect rather than just a witness. Instead, by the time the statements were forwarded, the momentum of the Portuguese investigation had shifted, Amaral was out, and the focus had moved elsewhere. The strongest, most direct warning about Payne was neutralized by timing. Supporters of the police, however, argue that bureaucratic delays are common, that paperwork crosses borders slowly, and that the statements were eventually delivered, even if late. They suggest that no conspiracy was necessary, only incompetence. Yet the incompetence argument struggles to explain why such an urgent lead, one that raised serious safeguarding concerns, could be left to languish for nearly half a year. In the eyes of many, incompetence becomes indistinguishable from protection. The broader implication is unsettling. If David Payne was shielded from early scrutiny, the Gaspar testimonies suggest that the shield was not accidental. At minimum, it meant investigators lost the chance to test his story, when memories were fresh, when inconsistencies might have surfaced, and when pressure could have forced cracks in the group's united front. At worst, it meant that someone, somewhere, decided it was safer not to ask those questions at all. The testimonies from Majorca remain controversial. Defenders of Payne insist that gestures can be misinterpreted, that jokes can be taken out of context, and that memory can exaggerate discomfort over time. They argue that without corroborating witnesses, it is impossible to treat the Gaspar's account as definitive evidence. Yet the gravity of Katerina's statement, her refusal to leave her daughter alone with Payne, cannot easily be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Parents act on instinct, and her instinct was one of fear. Even now, years later, the Majorca testimonies cast a long shadow over the case. They add depth to the hypothesis that David Payne was more than a bystander in Praia da Luz. They also reinforce the suspicion that those around him, including his wife and other members of the Tapas group, may have chosen to protect him rather than confront the truth. For every unanswered question about May 3, 2007, there is an echo from Majorca 2005, reminding investigators that red flags had been raised long before the night Madeleine disappeared. In the end, the Gaspar's words stand as one of the most chilling elements in the entire case. They offer a glimpse of behavior that struck two witnesses as deeply inappropriate. They reveal the instinctive caution of a mother who resolved never again to trust a man around her child. And they highlight the possibility that one of the central figures of the Praia da Luz holiday had already shown signs that should have demanded urgent attention. The fact that those warnings were not acted upon immediately and perhaps were deliberately delayed remains a scar on the investigation. Thus, the disturbing testimonies from Majorca 2005 do not simply add background color to the Madeleine McCann case. They form a critical piece of the puzzle, suggesting that danger had been present within the circle long before May 3, 2007. Whether the delay in forwarding them was incompetence or protection, the result was the same: the truth was postponed, perhaps permanently, and in the silence that followed, the trail grew colder, leaving behind questions that still demand answers. In every criminal investigation, time is one of the most critical elements. Establishing who was where and when is the foundation upon which guilt or innocence is often determined. In the Madeleine McCann case, the reconstruction of the timeline has always been fraught with inconsistencies. At the center of many of those inconsistencies stands David Payne. His movements on May 3, 2007, the very evening Madeleine disappeared, have never been fully clarified. When compared with the statements of others in the group, Payne seems to vanish at the very moments that mattered most. His timeline is not just incomplete, it is a loose thread, and one that was never pulled until it unraveled. The first major inconsistency comes at approximately 6:30 p.m. Payne has always claimed that he visited apartment 5A at that time. His stated purpose was simple: to check in on Kate McCann and the children while Jerry played tennis. According to Payne's version, he entered the apartment briefly, spoke with Kate, and saw the children, including Madeleine, calm and content. This, he said, reassured him that everything was fine. The problem, however, is that this story does not align neatly with what the McCanns themselves reported. Jerry, for instance, later testified that he arrived back at the apartment around the same time. When he entered, he said, Kate and the children were inside, but there was no mention of Payne being present. Kate, in her earliest statements, also made no reference to Payne's visit. Only later did her account shift, acknowledging that Payne had indeed stopped by. This discrepancy, though seemingly small, is of enormous importance. If Payne was truly there at 6:30, why did both McCanns initially fail to mention it? Was it an oversight born of stress, or was it an omission with purpose? Conversely, if Payne was not there, why would he insert himself into the timeline? Was it to establish his presence in the apartment at a time when Madeleine was last known to be alive? The contradictions around this single visit create doubt, not only about Payne's honesty, but about the reliability of the group's entire reconstruction of the evening. The second and perhaps more troubling gap comes later. Between 9:05 p.m. and 10 p.m. lies what many investigators and commentators have called the deadly hour. At 9:05, Jerry McCann conducted a check on his children. He reported that all was well. At around 10 p.m., Kate entered the apartment and discovered Madeleine missing. In that 55-minute window, Madeleine vanished. Every second of that time frame was therefore crucial, and investigators painstakingly attempted to account for each member of the group. But when it comes to David Payne, there is a vacuum. No one, not the McCanns, not the other Tapas friends, not staff at the Ocean Club, could confirm where he was or what he was doing during that period. Payne himself provided an account, but many observers found it suspiciously detailed, as though rehearsed. He spoke of events with a precision unusual for someone recalling a chaotic evening. Far from clarifying his movements, the detail raised further questions. Was this the genuine recall of a careful man, or the learned script of someone eager to present a consistent narrative? The absence of independent witnesses makes the question impossible to answer definitively. What is clear is that Payne's whereabouts in that crucial hour remain undocumented. When investigators compared the timelines of all the Tapas group members, these gaps became more glaring. Each friend could more or less account for their movements, checking on children, returning to the restaurant, speaking with staff. In nearly every reconstruction, there were overlaps where one member saw another, confirming their presence. Yet Payne repeatedly slipped through those nets of corroboration. At 16:30, his presence was contradicted by Jerry and only belatedly acknowledged by Kate. Between 9:05 and 10:00, he seemed to vanish altogether, with no one else noting his location. In an investigation built on cross-checking testimonies, Payne's story was the one that resisted verification. This is why many describe his timeline as the loose thread of the case. It was the part of the tapestry that did not fit, that could have unraveled the broader picture if pulled hard enough. Yet investigators, whether through lack of evidence or lack of will, never pulled that thread. Instead, Payne's account was allowed to stand, uncorroborated and unchallenged. The group's overall story held together, and the inconsistencies were quietly absorbed into the background noise of a case already overwhelmed by contradictions. The implications of this unresolved timeline are profound. If Payne was in apartment 5A at 6:30 as he claimed, then he may have been the last person outside the McCann family to see Madeleine alive. If he was absent between 9:05 and 10, as the gaps suggest, then he cannot be excluded from involvement in her disappearance. These are not trivial uncertainties, they go to the heart of what happened that night. And yet, despite their importance, they were never fully pursued. Some commentators argue that Payne's inconsistencies could have been innocent. Memory under stress is unreliable. People forget who was present or misremember times, particularly when tragedy strikes. Perhaps Jerry truly forgot that Payne was there at 6:30. Perhaps Kate only recalled it later, once she had time to process the evening. Perhaps Payne's detailed testimony was not rehearsed but simply the product of a careful man trying to be helpful. These possibilities cannot be dismissed out of hand. But others argue that, when taken together, the contradiction at 6:30, the absence at 9:05 to 10, the overly precise narrative Payne's timeline is more than flawed. It is suspicious. It suggests not only gaps in memory but gaps in truth. And those gaps matter, because they may conceal what really happened to Madeleine. The tragedy of the timeline is that it was never resolved. Investigators sketched the outlines, journalists highlighted the contradictions, but the loose thread was never tugged to the point of unraveling. As a result, Payne's movements on May 3 remain one of the lingering mysteries of the case. In a story defined by unanswered questions, his timeline stands as one of the most critical and one of the most neglected. Until that thread is pulled, until every minute is accounted for, the possibility will remain that the truth of Madeleine McCann's disappearance lies hidden not in distant theories of strangers or abductions, but in the unexplored gaps of a friend's story. In every criminal case, physical evidence is considered the most reliable witness. Human memory falters, testimonies contradict, but blood, fibers, and scent traces tell a story that cannot be easily altered. In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the most haunting and overlooked physical clues were not found far away or years later. They were discovered inside the family's own holiday apartment, at the heart of the investigation. And at the center of those clues lay a sofa in apartment 5A, a piece of furniture that became an unlikely but critical focus of forensic scrutiny. When British cadaver and blood detection dogs were brought into Praia da Luz months after the disappearance, their reactions shocked investigators. In the lounge area of the apartment, near the sofa, both dogs gave strong alerts. The cadaver dog signaled the scent of human decomposition, while the blood detection dog indicated traces of blood. These highly trained dogs had an extraordinary record of accuracy in other cases, and their alerts were taken seriously by forensic teams. They did not bark without cause. Their message was clear: something disturbing had once been present around that sofa. Investigators quickly removed the sofa for examination. Samples were taken, the area beneath and around it was swabbed, and the fibers and residues collected were shipped to specialized laboratories for analysis. The discovery of these materials sparked intense speculation. Why would there be traces of blood and scent consistent with decomposition in the very living space where the McCanns and their children had been staying? More troubling still, why near a sofa, an unlikely place for a child's blood or scent to be naturally present? The forensic analysis deepened the mystery. Among the materials collected were fibers that did not match the upholstery or fabric of the sofa, nor did they correspond with any furnishings inside apartment 5A. Instead, the fibers appeared to originate from external sources. Some observers noted that the color, weave, and texture seemed consistent with clothing material, not household fabric. And in whispers that grew louder with time, investigators quietly suggested that the fibers bore resemblance to clothing that David Payne had been seen wearing during the holiday. If true, this would be an extraordinary connection. Fibers near the sofa where cadaver and blood dogs had alerted that could potentially be linked to Payne. Though laboratory results did not produce definitive DNA matches, the presence of out-of-place fibers remained suspicious. It suggested that someone had been in contact with the sofa during a time when troubling biological traces were deposited, and that this someone might have been Payne. When questioned about these findings, Payne denied any connection. He dismissed the possibility that his clothing could have been responsible for stray fibers. To investigators, however, his demeanor raised eyebrows. He was not calm and clinical in his denials, as one might expect from a professional doctor accustomed to logical explanations. Instead, he appeared anxious, evasive, as if the subject made him deeply uncomfortable. Body language experts who later reviewed footage of his interviews remarked on this unease, pointing to signs of stress that contrasted with his otherwise confident manner. The issue is not whether stray fibers could find their way into a holiday apartment. Such a thing is always possible. Clothes shed fibers, and any visitor might leave behind traces without realizing it. The more critical issue is the context. These fibers were found in the exact area where both cadaver and blood dogs signaled. That combination of physical trace linked to clothing plus biological alerts suggesting blood and decomposition is profoundly suspicious. It transforms what might otherwise be dismissed as coincidence into a clue demanding urgent investigation. Yet, strangely, this avenue of inquiry was never pursued to its logical conclusion. The Portuguese police, already under immense pressure and criticized for missteps, did not press the issue further. The British authorities who later took over the review also appeared reluctant to make too much of the dog's alerts and the fiber evidence. The official reasoning was that without conclusive DNA results, the materials could not be tied definitively to Madeleine or to any suspect. As a result, the sofa and its fibers receded into the background of the case, a potentially explosive lead left unexplored. This raises the critical question: why? Why would investigators not follow through on physical evidence found inside the very apartment from which a child had disappeared? One explanation is scientific caution. Courts require absolute certainty, not suggestion, and fibers without DNA are weak evidence in a trial. Another explanation, however, is less benign. That pressing the fiber evidence too far would have pointed suspicion inward, toward members of the Tapas group, and possibly toward Payne himself. Such an outcome would have been politically and socially explosive, pitting friends against friends and casting doubt on the very people who had presented themselves as victims alongside the McCanns. The result was a kind of paralysis. Investigators acknowledged the fibers, documented the dog's alerts, and included these details in their files. But they did not push further, did not demand fresh samples from Payne's clothing, and did not reconstruct the scene with the intensity one might expect. Instead, the evidence was quietly set aside. To this day, it remains one of the great mysteries of the case, why physical clues of such potential significance were effectively ignored. For critics of the investigation, the answer is clear. The sofa and the fibers were not pursued, because pursuing them would have threatened to unravel the collective story told by the Tapas group. It would have introduced the possibility that one of their own was involved, that the disappearance was not the result of an external abduction, but of something that happened inside apartment 5A. Such a revelation would have required rethinking the entire case. It would have shifted suspicion away from strangers and onto friends. And it would have demanded a level of confrontation that neither the Portuguese nor the British authorities seemed prepared to face. The overlooked fibers are symbolic of the larger problem in the investigation. They represent a moment when the trail pointed inward, but was redirected outward. They show how physical evidence, which should have been pursued relentlessly, was allowed to fade under the weight of political, social, and institutional pressures. And they remind us that sometimes the truth is not buried for lack of clues, but for lack of will to confront where those clues lead. For those who believe David Payne was directly involved in Madeleine's disappearance, the sofa evidence is one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial support. It ties together physical traces, biological alerts, and behavioral anomalies. It explains why Payne seemed nervous when asked about the issue. And it underscores the suspicion that something happened inside apartment 5A that night, something far darker than the story of a stranger slipping through a window. In the end, the sofa and the strange fibers remain part of the enduring enigma of the Madeleine McCann case. They are a chapter that could have changed the course of the investigation, but instead became another unanswered question. The dogs bark. The scientists noted the anomalies, but the world moved on. The fibers were filed away, just as the truth seems to have been. Until that evidence is revisited, until the sofa's silent testimony is heard, the mystery of what happened in apartment 5A will remain incomplete. In the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the question of communication has always loomed large. Who called whom, at what times, and for what reasons? Phone records provide investigators with a silent witness, a map of activity that can confirm alibis or expose contradictions. In David Payne's case, however, those records raise questions rather than answer them. For the 24 hours surrounding Madeleine's disappearance, the most crucial window of the entire case, Payne's mobile phone activity is virtually non-existent. In fact, only one call stands out: a 3-minute call made on the afternoon of May 3, close to the McCanns' apartment. When asked about it later, Payne insisted he could not remember who he had called or why. At first glance, a single forgotten call may not seem extraordinary. People forget casual conversations, dismiss trivial contacts, and misplace details over time. But when a child disappears, and every minute becomes precious, a 3-minute call made near the scene cannot simply be brushed aside. Investigators rely on such anomalies to piece together the truth. The problem is that in Payne's case, that call exists in near isolation. For an entire day before and after Madeleine vanished, his phone shows no other meaningful activity. No texts, no calls, no pattern of normal communication, just silence. This silence is deeply unusual. In 2007, mobile phones were an everyday tool, used regularly by holidaymakers to check in with family, coordinate with friends, or confirm arrangements. Members of the Tapas group were no different. Their records show calls, texts, and patterns of activity consistent with people juggling childcare and socializing. Payne's phone, however, falls silent exactly when investigators would expect to see activity on the day Madeleine disappeared and the day after. The absence of communication is itself suspicious, for it suggests either that Payne deliberately refrained from using his phone or that he took steps to conceal his activity. The 3-minute call, then, becomes the focal point. It was made on the afternoon of May 3, reportedly from a location near apartment 5A. Payne himself admitted making the call, but claimed not to remember who he had contacted or why. To skeptics, this explanation strains credibility. A 3-minute call is not a misdial or a passing blip, it is a sustained exchange, long enough to convey information or make arrangements. Forgetting the content of such a call in the aftermath of a child's disappearance is, at best, implausible. At worst, it suggests evasion. Why does this matter? Because communication records are often the most reliable way to confirm or contradict testimony. They show whether someone's story aligns with their digital footprint. If Payne had been where he claimed, doing what he described, phone records could have helped verify it. Instead, his silence leaves only his word. And his word is already clouded by contradictions in the timeline and by testimonies from witnesses who viewed his behavior with suspicion. There are several possible explanations for this silence. The first, and most innocent, is coincidence. Perhaps Payne simply did not need to use his phone during that period. Perhaps he was focused on his family, on friends, and on the unfolding crisis once Madeleine went missing. After all, some people do go hours or even days without making calls. Yet this theory struggles against probability. During a group holiday, with multiple children to manage and social plans constantly shifting, it would be highly unusual for a parent not to use their phone at all. Other members of the tapas group had records of ordinary communication. Payne did not. The second explanation is forgetfulness. Perhaps the 3-minute call truly was trivial, and Payne's failure to remember it was a simple lapse. But again, context matters. In the days after Madeleine disappeared, every friend was asked to recall their actions in painstaking detail. Most gave specific accounts of times, movements, and conversations. For Payne to forget one of his only calls during that critical day is unlikely. It raises the possibility that the call's content was something he preferred not to disclose. The third explanation is more troubling. Some investigators and commentators have suggested that Payne's silence was not natural but intentional, that he avoided using his phone during that 24-hour window to prevent a trail of evidence. In this reading, the 3-minute call becomes even more significant. It may have been the only necessary communication, and once it was made, he deliberately went silent. Such behavior would be consistent with someone attempting to erase or minimize their digital footprint. It would not prove guilt, but it would fit a pattern of concealment. Adding weight to this theory is Payne's demeanor when questioned about the call. Reports note that he appeared uneasy, evasive, and defensive. Instead of offering plausible speculation, such as that it might have been a work colleague, a family member, or a friend he simply claimed not to remember. This avoidance prevented investigators from confirming the recipient or content of the call, leaving only the record of its existence. It was as if he wanted the subject closed rather than clarified. Forensic investigators know that silence itself can be evidence. A lack of communication at crucial times is not random, it often points to deliberate behavior. In cases of abduction or disappearance, suspects sometimes turn off phones, avoid calls, or use alternative devices to avoid detection. Payne's 24-hour silence may fall into this category. It is possible he wanted to ensure that no calls could place him near certain locations or reveal contacts that might have raised suspicion. If that is true, the implications are serious. It would mean that Payne anticipated the need to avoid scrutiny, that he was conscious of leaving traces, and that he took steps to prevent it. Combined with his contradictory timeline, his detailed yet suspicious testimony, and the disturbing testimonies from Majorca 2005, the silent phone becomes part of a larger mosaic. It suggests not only gaps in memory but gaps in truth. Yet despite the significance of this anomaly, the call and the silence were never fully investigated. Authorities did not release details of who received the call, nor did they press Payne further on his inability to recall it. Like so many aspects of the case, the lead was noted and then allowed to fade. Critics argue that this failure reflects a broader reluctance to confront uncomfortable possibilities within the tapas group. The silence of the phone, like the silence of the friends, became part of the larger pact of silence that has frustrated investigators for years. In conclusion, the mysterious 3-minute call and the 24 hours of phone silence remain some of the most puzzling elements of the Madeleine McCann case. They represent not just an absence of data, but an absence of answers. Was Payne's silence an innocent coincidence, the result of forgetfulness, or a calculated effort to erase his digital trail? We may never know. What is certain is that in a case defined by unanswered questions, the quiet of David Payne's phone speaks volumes. Until that silence is explained, The possibility will linger that it hides the truth of what happened to Madeleine on that tragic night. In any high-profile criminal investigation, especially one as globally scrutinized as the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, public attention tends to gravitate toward the central figures. Kate and Jerry McCann became household names, not only because they were Madeleine's parents, but because the media, the police, and the public dissected their every move. They were criticized for dining with friends while leaving the children asleep, examined for body language in press conferences, and even named arguido formal suspects by Portuguese police at one stage. Whether fairly or unfairly, their lives became an open book. By contrast, David Payne, one of the closest friends present during that holiday, seemed to glide past the storm with remarkable ease. He remained in the background, shielded from the intense scrutiny that engulfed the McCanns. The contrast is puzzling. Payne's name was certainly mentioned in reports, but he was never subjected to the relentless media interrogation faced by the McCanns. Headlines did not swarm around him. He was not the subject of speculative documentaries or tabloid exposés in the same way. Despite the troubling testimonies about his behavior in Majorca 2005, despite inconsistencies in his timeline, and despite unexplained anomalies in phone and forensic evidence, Payne occupied a peculiar position near the center of events, yet somehow invisible to widespread suspicion. It was as if a protective barrier surrounded him, shielding him from the same intensity of inquiry others endured. One striking example of this shielding emerges from the account of Yvonne Martin, a social services professional from the UK. Shortly after Madeleine's disappearance, Martin traveled to Praia da Luz to offer assistance. Upon seeing David Payne, she reportedly felt a jolt of recognition. She believed she had encountered him in connection with another child protection case in the past. According to her statement, when she approached and offered her professional help to the McCann family, Payne intervened and discouraged her. This detail is deeply troubling. If a trained professional with safeguarding experience recognized Payne from a prior case and was prevented from contributing her expertise, it raises questions not only about Payne's role, but about why her input was so quickly disregarded. Martin's account should have been a flashing red light for investigators. At minimum, it warranted a thorough exploration of Payne's background and prior involvement in any child-related cases. Yet her concerns, like the Gaspar statements, seem to dissolve into the fog of bureaucratic delay and investigative inertia. Her testimony was noted but never acted upon with vigor. For critics, this was not just oversight, it was another instance of Payne being protected, whether deliberately or by the inertia of a system unwilling to turn suspicion inward. The broader context reinforces this impression of systemic silence. Observers coined the phrase, silent alliance, to describe the Tapas 7, the group of friends who dined together that night. They seemed bound by an unspoken agreement never to contradict each other in ways that would unravel their collective credibility. Each member gave statements that overlapped just enough to protect the group, even if small discrepancies remained. None of them ever broke rank to raise suspicions about Payne. If they had doubts, they kept them to themselves. This unity may have been driven by fear of being accused of negligence for leaving their children alone, but it also had the effect of shielding one another from deeper suspicion. Within that protective silence, Payne's inconsistencies were absorbed and never singled out. The media, too, played its part. From the earliest days of the case, coverage focused overwhelmingly on the McCanns. They were the parents, and in the eyes of both Portuguese and British tabloids, they were the obvious narrative anchors. Speculation about their possible involvement, fueled by Amaril's investigation and later his book, dominated headlines. Meanwhile, references to Payne were rare, usually buried in longer reports or treated as peripheral. The disturbing Gaspar statements, which directly implicated Payne in inappropriate comments, received little sustained coverage. They were mentioned, then forgotten. In a story that thrived on sensationalism, the fact that such explosive testimony did not ignite further inquiry is itself remarkable. Law enforcement mirrored this silence. The Portuguese police, under pressure from international media and constrained by limited resources, focused their suspicions heavily on the McCanns. The British police, through Operation Grange, later directed attention toward an external suspect, Christian Bruckner. In both cases, Payne was left largely unexamined. His alibis were not thoroughly tested, his inconsistencies not aggressively challenged, and the physical and testimonial anomalies linked to him were not prioritized. Officially, this may be explained by evidentiary thresholds. Without definitive proof, investigators were reluctant to pursue a line of inquiry that might appear speculative. But critics argue that the reluctance itself became a form of protection. By never testing the suspicions fully, authorities ensured that Payne remained insulated from the kind of scrutiny that might have broken the case open. So, is this pattern of silence mere coincidence? Or is it evidence of a web of protection? Defenders of the official investigation argue that Payne simply was not a viable suspect. They point out that his testimony, while imperfect, was consistent over time. They note that no DNA or definitive forensic link tied him to Madeleine's disappearance. They argue that the media had no reason to spotlight him when the parents themselves were under such intense suspicion. From this perspective, Payne was shielded not by conspiracy, but by the absence of hard evidence. Yet this explanation does not fully satisfy. Coincidence cannot easily account for the repeated pattern of key testimonies about Payne delayed or dismissed. Professionals like Yvonne Martin ignored, the media uninterested, investigators consistently looking elsewhere. When silence accumulates across multiple layers, friends, press, police, it begins to look less like happenstance and more like design. A web of protection need not be a formal conspiracy. It can emerge organically as institutions and individuals unconsciously align to protect the familiar, the respectable, the one whose guilt would be too destabilizing to contemplate. Payne, as a doctor, a father, and a friend within the group, may have benefited from precisely this kind of unconscious shielding. This phenomenon is not unique to the McCann case. History shows that groups under scrutiny often close ranks, that communities protect their own, and that uncomfortable suspicions are deflected rather than confronted. But in this case, the stakes were unimaginably high: the disappearance of a child. If Payne was shielded by systemic silence, whether deliberate or accidental, the cost was the loss of truth. It meant that a potentially critical line of inquiry was never pursued with the rigor it demanded. In the end, the strange protection surrounding David Payne remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the Madeleine McCann case. He was there, inside the circle, mentioned in troubling testimonies, linked to anomalies in forensic and communication evidence. Yet he never became the focus of scrutiny, never endured the relentless questioning faced by others. The silence around him by friends, by media, by investigators was too consistent to ignore. Was it coincidence, or was it a web of protection? Until those questions are confronted honestly, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann will remain shrouded not only in mystery, but in silence. Over the years, the search for answers in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann has taken investigators across continents, through countless leads, and into the lives of dozens of potential suspects. In the public imagination, the narrative has shifted many times from an abduction by a stranger, to suspicion of the parents themselves, to a series of other figures who briefly captured the attention of police and media. Most recently, Christian Bruckner, a convicted German offender with a long criminal record, emerged as the central suspect. For nearly 3 years, his name dominated headlines. Investigators in Germany described him as the man who fit the profile, who had both the means and opportunity to abduct Madeleine. Yet despite this focus, prosecutors were forced to concede a stark truth: they did not have enough evidence to bring formal charges. And once again, the case seemed to collapse into uncertainty. The Bruckner chapter is revealing not only for what it suggested about him, but for what it obscured about others. While newspapers printed his photo and television panels debated his alleged involvement, another name, the name of someone who had been present in Praia da Luz, inside the circle of trust, was almost entirely absent from the discussion. That name was David Payne. The contrast is striking. Bruckner was not in the tapas group, not a friend of the McCanns, not someone sharing dinner just yards away while Madeleine slept. He was an outsider, later linked by circumstantial evidence, such as phone records and a history of offenses. By focusing so intently on him, investigators and the public diverted attention from those within the group whose timelines, testimonies, and behaviors had raised serious questions from the very beginning. Among them, Payne's inconsistencies stood out. Yet while Bruckner became the main suspect, Payne became a forgotten one. German prosecutors eventually admitted they lacked conclusive evidence tying Bruckner to Madeleine's disappearance. They could not prove he was near the Ocean Club that night, nor that he had direct contact with the McCanns or their children. They acknowledged gaps in their theory, weaknesses in their case. The promises of imminent charges faded into silence, leaving the world once again with no resolution. Critics pointed out that years of resources and attention had been directed at a suspect who could not be tied definitively to the crime, while stronger early anomalies linked to someone inside the group were left unexplored. This raises a critical question: why was David Payne not re-examined? His name was tied to the most unsettling testimonies from Majorca 2005. His timeline contained contradictions such as the contested 6:30 p.m. visit to apartment 5A and his unexplained whereabouts between 9:05 and 10 p.m. His phone records showed an unusual 24-hour silence during the crucial period. Forensic dogs alerted near the sofa in the McCann apartment, where fibers inconsistent with the furnishings were found, later rumored to resemble clothing Payne had worn. Added to this was the testimony of social worker Y. Von Martin, who believed she recognized him from a prior child protection case. These were not trivial coincidences. They were serious anomalies that, in any thorough investigation, should have demanded persistent follow-up. And yet, instead of being pursued with vigor, Payne was gradually pushed into the background. His name appeared less and less frequently in reports. The public fixation shifted to Bruckner, and with that shift, the possibility of re-evaluating Payne seemed to disappear altogether. It is as though once the spotlight turned toward Germany, the willingness to reconsider older, unresolved suspicions evaporated. Some argue that this was simply the natural evolution of an investigation. Bruckner presented an appealing narrative, a known offender living in Portugal at the time, with access to vehicles and properties, and a criminal profile that seemed to fit the crime. Payne, by contrast, was a respected doctor, a friend, a family man. It was easier for both investigators and the public to accept that the danger had come from outside the circle rather than from within it. Focusing on Bruckner allowed the investigation to move outward, away from the uncomfortable suspicion of those closest to Madeleine. But others see in this shift a troubling pattern. By placing so much emphasis on Bruckner, authorities effectively deflected attention from the contradictions surrounding Payne. In doing so, they may have reinforced the pact of silence that appeared to shield the Tapas group from deeper scrutiny. It is not that Payne was ever officially cleared, it is that he was never fully investigated in the first place. His anomalies were noted but not pursued, documented but not explained. When Bruckner emerged, Payne's file was quietly placed back on the shelf. The result is that today, when the public thinks of Madeleine's disappearance, many immediately associate it with Bruckner, despite the lack of evidence. Meanwhile, Payne's name has faded from common discussion, despite being tied to multiple red flags within the original investigation. This reversal of focus highlights not just the failings of one suspect theory, but the fragility of the entire process. By allowing attention to drift toward an external figure, investigators may have missed or chosen to ignore what was in plain sight. So the question lingers: why not look again? If Bruckner could not be charged due to insufficient evidence, why not revisit the anomalies connected to Payne? Why not re-examine the Gaspar statements, the contested timeline, the forensic alerts, and the phone silence? Why not test whether the collective silence of the Tapas group was protecting more than just reputations? The reluctance to do so suggests either that authorities genuinely believed Payne posed no risk, or that pursuing him was considered too disruptive, too destabilizing to the broader narrative. In the absence of definitive answers, speculation thrives. Some believe Payne was overlooked because suspicion of an insider would have shattered the public story, transforming the case from a tragedy of abduction into a darker tale of betrayal within the group. Others argue that institutional reluctance, bureaucracy, and the sheer passage of time made it easier to follow new leads abroad rather than revisit old ones at home. Whatever the reason, the effect has been the same: Payne, whose name was once tied to some of the most troubling inconsistencies, has become a forgotten figure in the story of Madeleine McCann. The irony is unavoidable. Bruckner, who may never face trial for Madeleine's disappearance, became the central character of recent years. Payne, who was present in Praia da Luz, inside the McCanns' circle of friends, and linked to troubling testimonies, became a footnote. This inversion of focus is not just puzzling, it is potentially catastrophic for the pursuit of truth. If investigators continue to chase suspects who cannot be tied to the crime while ignoring anomalies tied to those who were there, the case may never be solved. In conclusion, the story of Christian Bruckner's rise and fall as the main suspect is not only about him. It is about what his prominence concealed. It is about how attention was directed outward, while the most uncomfortable questions, those tied to David Payne, were quietly left behind. German prosecutors admitted they lacked evidence against Bruckner. That admission should have been the moment to look again at the unresolved anomalies within the group, to revisit Payne's file with fresh urgency. Instead, silence prevailed. And until that silence is broken, Madeleine McCann's disappearance will remain not just an unsolved mystery, but a case where the main suspect was forgotten, while the most troubling suspect was never truly examined at all. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is more than the story of a missing child. It is a study in contradictions, silence, and the choices that shape investigations. 17 years on, the world still does not know what happened on the night of May 3, 2007. What we do know is that the official narrative has shifted repeatedly from stranger abduction to suspicion of the parents to the focus on Christian Bruckner. Along the way, however, crucial anomalies tied to David and Fiona Payne, their conflicting timelines, unsettling testimonies, unexplained silences, and potential links to physical evidence were never fully pursued. David Payne placed himself inside apartment 5A at 6:30 p.m., yet his presence was contradicted by others. Between 9:05 and 10 p.m., the window in which Madeleine vanished, no one could verify where he was. Dogs alerted to blood and decomposition near the sofa, where fibers inconsistent with the furnishings were discovered, rumored to resemble his clothing. His phone fell silent for 24 hours, save for a 3-minute call he later claimed not to remember. Fiona, meanwhile, stood at his side, steadfastly silent, never contradicting him, never breaking the pact of silence that seemed to bind the Tapas group together. Individually, each of these anomalies might be explained. Collectively, they paint a troubling picture. And yet, rather than pulling at these loose threads, investigators allowed them to fade into the background. Payne was never officially cleared, but neither was he fully examined. He became invisible in a case that consumed the lives of others. The silence surrounding him by friends, by media, by investigators became its own kind of protection. What lesson can we take from this? First, that silence is not absence. Silence is a choice. When witnesses refuse to speak, when institutions delay sharing testimony, when authorities look away from inconvenient suspects, silence itself becomes evidence. It shows us not only what is being hidden, but who benefits from its concealment. Second, the Madeleine McCann case reminds us of the danger of selective scrutiny. Some suspects, like the McCanns themselves or Christian Bruckner, were placed under relentless pressure. Others, like David and Fiona Payne, remained largely untouched. Justice requires consistency, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it points inward, even if it challenges the comfortable narratives of friendship, respectability, or professional status. Finally, the tragedy of Madeleine McCann teaches us that truth is fragile when it is left in the hands of silence. The unanswered questions around the Paynes may never be resolved, but the broader lesson is one that extends beyond this case in any society. Transparency, accountability, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths are essential. Without them, justice falters, and the innocent remain lost not only in life, but in memory. Madeleine's story is unfinished, and perhaps it always will be. Yet her disappearance is more than a mystery, it is a warning. A warning of what happens when silence protects the wrong people. When investigators stop pulling at the threads that don't fit. And when the truth is allowed to slip away into the shadows.